Hello. Here we go. Brian's Winter, Chapter 9. Remember at the end of Chapter 8, he referenced finding a moose. So perhaps Chapter 9 will explain what he meant by that. He prepared for hunting by putting his hatchet and knife on his belt and one of those butane lighters in his pocket. He started to take the light bow, but thought that he might see something big and wanted to take a shot, so he took the war bow under the theory that he could shoot something small with the big bow, but he couldn't shoot a deer with the small bow. So he took the large bow and the new lance and 5 arrows with stone points and went hunting. At the start, he almost couldn't hunt. The woods were so beautiful, so changed. It was a whole different world. That he walked slowly along and feasted his eyes on first one scene and then another. It should all be framed, he thought, framed in some way to take back. Take back. He hadn't thought that in a long while either. Pictures of home were fading. But if he could show this to his mother, he thought, just for her to see this. He shook his head and almost at the same instant saw a rabbit. It was sitting under an overhanging evergreen limb back in the shadows, but still very easy to see because it was brown. On its back there were several white spots, each about as large as a silver dollar. Brian had seen several rabbits with similar white spots and had thought they were some kind of fluke or mutation. But he guessed now that they actually changed color in the winter and became white so that they wouldn't be so visible. Without it, Brian thought, they were dead meat. A week or so earlier, he had walked through and seen one rabbit in this area. He now took 20 steps and saw 7, all at varying ranges, none close enough to shoot, all standing out like sore thumbs because they were brown against the white snow. He moved easily, slowly, waiting for a close shot. When it came, a rabbit not more than 20 feet away, he shot carefully and only missed by a hair, actually cutting the fur along the top of the rabbit's shoulders. The rabbit dodged left, then right, and vanished into the underbrush, and Brian went forward to get his arrow. At first, he couldn't find it. He'd seen it fly, had seen exactly where it went into the snow. There was a hole marking the arrow's entry, but it wasn't there. He dug in the snow, but still couldn't find it, and didn't find it until he'd stepped back and lined up the flight of the arrow and worked along the snow, scooping it out every foot. The arrow had gone more than 30 feet after entering the snow, skittering along beneath the surface before coming to rest. He'd have to be careful of his shots, he thought, pulling it out and blowing the snow off the feathers. He'd lose all his arrows on one hunt. He moved on, still taken by the beauty, and had 3 more shots, all of which he missed because the targets were so small, rabbits. And he wasn't used to shooting the big, heavier bow yet. I'll have to get closer, he thought. Work right up on them. Get into the thicker brush. He slowed his pace even more and moved into a large stand of brambles and thick young evergreens, packed so closely he couldn't see more than 10 feet, and that only by crouching down and looking along the ground. It was hard going. Every limb pulled at the bow, and he had to be careful not to wreck the feathers on the arrows as he moved. There were rabbits everywhere. The snow was covered with their tracks, and he had moved nearly 50 yards into the thick brush when the sound of a breaking limb stopped him cold. Rabbits and foolbirds did not break limbs when they moved. Deer broke limbs. Bear broke limbs. Almost simultaneously, he saw different tracks in the snow in front of him. Big tracks, huge tracks. The hair went up on his neck. They were big enough for Bear, and what he really didn't want to do in his whole life was meet a bear in thick brush, especially if it was the bear that had a memory of a bad night with a skunk. But when he leaned down to study the tracks, he saw they had a cloven hoof, like those left by deer, but larger, much larger. Moose, he knew instantly. He had seen moose several times since he had been attacked last summer. Once he had seen a bull with a rack so large that Brian easily could have fit between the antlers. The rest had been cows. They were all unbelievably big. And after he'd been attacked by the cow along the lake, he'd given them a wide berth. When they got angry, it was like having a Buick mad at you. But, he thought, just that at first. But what? But the moose are smaller now? But I'm tougher now? He shook his head, pushed the thoughts away, the sneaky thoughts, the ones that said he was hunting meat for food. Moose were made out of meat. He had a larger bow. Primitive people hunted moose with weapons like this. He was different now. He heard the sound again, a breaking limb, close, maybe 30 yards. And he crouched down and looked along the snow as he had for rabbits. There, a brown leg moving, then another. Like small trees they were, suddenly moving small trees. He held his breath and crouched, waiting. He could not see more of the moose, just the legs. And as he watched, they moved off to the left a bit, hesitated, then turned left again and started moving slowly, directly at him. Ah, he thought, there it is. Like it or not, I'm about to hunt moose. His stomach tightened, and he stood and quickly glanced at his position. The brush was too thick for him to run, even if he had wanted to. And the truth was, he didn't want to. He was different. He did have better weapons, and there was a lot of meat on a moose. No room, he thought, to maneuver or to shoot. He moved his head to the right, and all he could see was thick brush. Then to the left, and it was the same. No, there, a small opening. Not 4 feet across and about 4 feet off the ground. Almost a tunnel through the brush. But if it all worked right, all worked exactly right, he might be able to get a shot. He moved to the left and stood facing the opening, leaned the killing lance against a nearby bush, held the bow up, with the top tipped slightly to the right to keep it out of the brush, and put his best arrow on the string, ready to draw, and waited. And waited. Time seemed to stop. Somewhere to his left, he heard the soft sound of a bird's wings, then the scratchy sound of a chickadee. Brush cracked directly in front of him, but he could see nothing. Another bird flew past. He aged, waiting. And now he heard the moose stepping, its hooves shushing in the snow, and another breaking branch, and then a line, a curved line as the side of the moose's front end came into view in the tunnel. Brian tensed, his fingers tightening on the string. The edge of the shoulder moving slowly, ever so slowly to the left, bringing more and more of the moose's chest into view. A third there, then a half, then 2/3, then the whole chest. Brian drew the shaft back. A cow, his brain registered. A large cow moose. No antlers. A little spit dripping from the side of her mouth. Brown eyes looking at him, but not seeing him. Or at least he hoped not. 20 feet, no more. 6-7 paces at the most. He released the bowstring. He could see it all later in his mind's eye, so it all must have registered. But when he did it, everything happened so fast, and yet incredibly slowly, that it all seemed one event. The arrow jumped from the string, and he saw the feathers fly straight away from him and at the moose, and slam into the moose's neck just above the center of her chest. And in that instant, in that same split second, the moose caught the movement of the bow and arrow in Brian's head and charged. So fast, she almost met the arrow. If Brian had expected the brush to slow her down, or the arrow striking her to handicap her, he was sadly mistaken. She was at him like a cat, so fast that she seemed like a blur, and yet his mind took it all in. I hit her. The arrow hit her in the neck. She's charging. She's charging at me. Another arrow. No time. The lance. That's it, the lance. He threw the bow aside and reached for the lance, all in one motion, and all too late. He felt his hand clamp on the shaft of the lance, and at the same time she came out of the brush on top of him. He had one fleeting image of a wall of brown hair with the feathers of the arrow sticking out of the middle, and he went down. He would never know what saved him. She was gigantic and on him, and he thought she would crush him, mash him into the ground. But either the arrow hampered her movement or her momentum carried her too far, and she went over Brian and had to turn and come back at him. He was hurt, his leg, his shoulder, yet he could move, and he rolled, still holding the killing lance, and came up to a kneeling position. He raised the head of the lance just as she hit him again. One image. She threw herself at him, her eyes red with rage, and he saw her run onto the lance, the point entering her chest just below the arrow. Then her head hit his forehead. Brian saw one flash of white light, as bright as all the snow, then nothing but pain and darkness. All right, well, that is the end of chapter 9. So you'll have to wait until next week to find out what happened to the moose and to Brian. See you later.